So what is the legal status of the Hawaiian Kingdom of my great-grandparents? Let's start with them first, not with what we think today. Well, according to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which is the oldest world court since 1899, it said that in the 19th century, the Hawaiian Kingdom existed as an independent state, recognized as such by the United States, Great Britain, and various other states. So when you see the word state, state means country, but the word independent is important because you can be a nation and not be independent. Say the state of New York. State of New York is not independent, but it exists in a federation within the United States. The United States of America is independent, and what independence refers to, it's a political term which applies to its laws. So within U.S. territory, within U.S. territory, only American laws apply over that territory, to the exclusion of Canadian law over Canadian territory, to the exclusion of Mexican law over Mexican territory. That is what is called independence and sovereignty. Okay. So when the United States recognized the Hawaiian Kingdom as an independent state, what they're basically stating is that their citizens, when they come to Hawaii, are subject to Hawaiian Kingdom law, statutory, case law, proclamations, administrative policies, the legal order. Right? That's what independence means. But also for Hawaiian subjects, like for my great-grandfather, William Kuakini Simerson, if he was to travel to California, he'll be subject to American law. He could not claim protection under Hawaiian law. So that's what sovereignty means, right? Well, the Hawaiian Kingdom was recognized since 1843 as an independent state. Now, in 1893, there were only 44 independent states in the world. Just 44. Hawaii was one of them. And it was called the Family of Nations. By 1945, it went up to 47 independent states. 46 of them formed the United Nations in San Francisco. And by today, there are 197 independent states throughout the world. 193 of them are members of the United Nations. You don't have to be a member of the UN to be an independent state. An example would be Switzerland. Switzerland did not join the United Nations until 2002, right? So the issue is really whether or not you're an independent state, not what organization are you a member of, right? That's important.
The expert on all of this, difference between colonization and occupation and the status of independent states and how an independent state can be annexed, because there's a way to do that. The foremost expert here is Keanu.
Well, what I thought I knew was that Hawaii was a part of the United States and I'm in the Army. I'm in the Field Artillery. I began to realize then that what I thought I knew all of a sudden was not relevant anymore. Because what I found out, just from my military perspective, what happened in 1893, January 17th, was an illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom government, not the country. I knew in the intel briefs that we received from Desert Storm, there was a puppet government there set up by Iraq called the Provisional Government of Kuwait. And here I'm looking at Hawaii, these guys are calling themselves the Provisional Government of Hawaii. And then later, that Provisional Government of Kuwait, I knew, changed its name to the Republic of Kuwait. And that's exactly what the Provisional Government did of Hawaii. They changed its name to the Republic of Hawaii, and then asked to be annexed, just as the Republic of Kuwait was asking to be annexed.
Iraq and its leaders must be held liable for these crimes of abuse and destruction.
And they were disguising themselves to be Kuwaitis, when in fact they were Iraqi nationals. And they called themselves the Provisional Government of Kuwait. I'm serious, I'm not even making this stuff up. And then they later changed their name to the Republic of Kuwait. And they asked Iraq to annex them. And then they annexed them and it became a province of Kuwait. Of Iraq. I am not lying.
Is a redoubling of Saddam Hussein's efforts to destroy completely Kuwait and its people.
And then, just as Iraq unilaterally seized Kuwait and said, you're annexed, that's the same thing that the United States did in 1898 in a joint resolution of Congress saying, we annexed you. The parallels were unbelievable. And I quickly saw Hawaii's situation just because of my experience with the first Gulf War. I didn't really understand how a country can become a part of another country. I would only find that out later. But I knew Hawaii was not part of the United States and that we're occupied. And that just as Iraq was not complying with the law of occupation, the Hague and Geneva Conventions, the United States was not complying with the law of occupation either. So where Iraq occupied Kuwait for 7.5 months, I'm looking at this situation back in 1992, almost a century of occupation. And that's when I began to realize I might be in the wrong army.
Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met. Kuwait is once more in the hands of Kuwaitis in control of their own destiny. We share in their joy, a joy tempered only by our compassion for their ordeal. Tonight, the Kuwaiti flag once again flies above the capital of a free and sovereign nation.
So that's how I came to realizing Hawaii's occupied. I didn't learn it from a professor. I didn't learn it from taking a class. I learned it from my experience at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, going through Officers Advanced Course as a captain during the first Gulf War and receiving real-life intel coming in. It was only until 1992 when I started to look up my genealogy, because my tutu asked me, I need to know my genealogy, because then she said I would know who I am and what I need to do, is when I started to uncover these things. And that's when I started to realize, wow, the parallels from what happened with Iraq and Kuwait to Hawaii and the United States was undeniable. And I set out on a course to try to get this information refuted. It was almost as if I woke up and everybody's still sleeping. And this was that road that I chose to take to address some very, very hard issues, very hard issues. When you are an independent state, which Kuwait was since 1961, an independent state has what is called a government. Those two are not synonymous. A country is separate from its government, and a government is separate from its country. Because during international relations between countries, governments get overthrown when they're at war. International law regulates war. That's why it's regulated by the Hague and Geneva Conventions and what is called international humanitarian law. But the overthrow of the Kuwaiti government back in 1990 did not mean the Kuwait country ceased to exist. It still existed, and we knew that. We called that occupation, and that Iraq was supposed to have been administering Kuwaiti law until they get a treaty of peace. Annexation of Kuwait did not terminate Iraq's liability or responsibility. Well, that same situation happened to Hawaii. So Hawaii's sovereignty was recognized in 1843, November 28th. And when I say the country, the Hawaiian Kingdom, is multi-ethnic. In fact, when you say Hawaiian in the Hawaiian Kingdom era, it was a short term for Hawaiian subject, which is a nationality. You can be Chinese and be Hawaiian. You can be black and be Hawaiian. You can be Haole and be Hawaiian. You can be Aboriginal or Kanaka and be Hawaiian. But under American law, the term Hawaiian it's ethnocentric. It's based on ethnicity. That's not what the kingdom was about. Okay, so I just want to make that point. Okay, and that sovereignty was exercised by the Hawaiian Kingdom government. Well, that government, we know, was illegally overthrown in 1893, admitted it was illegal by the United States President, Cleveland. But by overthrowing a government, that did not mean the country ceased to exist. So how did the Hawaiian Islands become a part of the United States? That's a fundamental question, right? How? Well, annexation. This is how annexation takes place between countries, called international law. Cession of state territory is the transfer of sovereignty over state territory by the owner state to another state. And the only form in which a cession can be effected is an agreement embodied in a treaty between the ceding and the acquiring state. Remember that term ceded lands that the Madam Chair brought up earlier? Ceded lands. That's assuming something got ceded. This is how cession is supposed to take place. You're going to start to see some things that may shock you. So here we have two sovereign entities, two sovereign countries, both have their governments that represent them. One will cede territory to another country, either voluntary, right, they negotiate, or involuntary, as a result of war. There's nothing wrong with acquiring territory through war. It's called Treaty of Conquest, or otherwise a Treaty of Peace. The majority of the United States was acquired through ceded lands from foreign countries. The first land to be transferred to the United States from a foreign country happened in 1803, and that's called the Louisiana Purchase. Okay? So prior to 1803, French law applied over that territory. After 1803, American law applied over that territory. That was followed up in 1819, a cession from Spain, which is the area that we know today as Florida. Pacific Northwest from the British in 1846. Alaska, 1867, from Russia. These were voluntary cessions, negotiated, like conveying property, right? Compensation. But you also have an example, a few examples, but one here, a Treaty of Conquest, Treaty of Peace, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, that ended the Mexican-American War. All territory north of the Rio Grande. The area used to be Mexican territory, subject to Mexican municipal law. After 1848, it was subject to American municipal law. So what is the authority of Hawaii's annexation? Obviously, we would have to look for a treaty, especially when we keep saying ceded lands today, because ceded lands implies there's been a transaction. Something was ceded. Actually, it goes back to July 7, 1898, a joint resolution to provide for annexing the Hawaiian Islands to the United States. A joint resolution is not a treaty. A joint resolution is municipal law of the United States Congress. It's not a treaty, and that's important. Now, what were the congressmen saying at that time regarding this prospect of annexing Hawaii without a treaty? Well, of many senators and representatives on the record, Senator William Allen from Nebraska said it best. He said the Constitution and the statutes are territorial in their operation. That is, they can have no binding force or operation beyond the territorial limits of the government in which they are promulgated. In other words, the Constitution and statutes cannot reach across the territorial boundaries of the United States into the territorial domain of another government and affect that government or persons or property therein. Much in the same way as the county council cannot pass ordinances that apply to Hawaii Island cannot pass any ordinance that applies to Maui. At the macro level, that would apply to the national legislation of the United States Congress. And then he goes on to say, for the record, the joint resolution of annexation is ipso facto null and void. So he's not arguing you can't annex. He says this never happened because it's an American law. It's not a treaty. 2 years later, the United States Congress passed another law called the Organic Act, April 30th, 1900, renaming the Hawaiian Kingdom government, its infrastructure, to the territory of Hawaii. And in 1959, the United States passed another law, Public Law 86-3, called the Statehood Act. Again, it's a municipal law. And then in 1993, the United States Congress passed a joint resolution apologizing for the illegal overthrow. But again, it's just an American law, limited to US territory. So what does the United States Supreme Court say about US laws? It says neither the Constitution nor the laws passed in pursuance of it, referring to the federal Constitution and the federal statutes, have any force in foreign country. They don't have any force in a foreign country because of that country's independence. On December 18, 1893, the United States President admitted to the United States Congress in a manifesto, by an act of war, the government of a friendly and confiding people has been overthrown. Act of war, that is a trigger word for state of war, which initiates the law of occupation, takes it out of the state of peace. Overthrowing the government does not equate to an overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom as an independent state. So the focus should have been not getting a government, but whether or not the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists. That's the focus that nobody was looking at. January 17, 1893 marks the beginning of the American occupation. So what were the laws of occupation that existed at that particular time? Okay, in political science and law, we called it intertemporal law. You cannot judge a situation back then using law of today. You have to use the law that was contemporaneous to that time, right? Well, the law of occupation in 1893 obligated the United States to administer Hawaiian Kingdom law. They did that in Mexico during its war. They did that with the Spanish colonies in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. These obligations are now codified under Article 43 of the Hague Convention and Article 64 of the Geneva Convention. So why is it that we don't know this information, and people who are probably listening to this for the first time are probably in shock? You know, I say that people tend to quickly go from the OMG to the WTF. Well, here's the answer why we don't know, and it's okay, because I'm not here to blame anybody. We're all victims of circumstance. The insurgents, they're all dead. The children are not insurgents, right? If my dad committed a crime, don't blame me. Hold my dad accountable, right? So this is not about blaming. This is about understanding. So here is a guy named Samuel Damon. He's an insurgent. By the way, he's a Hawaiian subject. He's Hawaiian, not by ethnicity, right? And in 1895, when he also served as trustee of the Kamehameha schools, he stated on the record, if we are ever to have peace and annexation, the first thing to do is to obliterate the past. Obliterate the past. Now that is an arrogant statement, but it speaks to something more heinous if it's carried out into a policy. It's called denationalization. So denationalization is an international term, not to be confused with assimilation. That's within local politics. Denationalization is to obliterate the national consciousness of the occupied state. And denationalization in 1919, after World War I, was designated as a war crime during occupations. Specifically, the war crime attempts to denationalize the inhabitants of occupied territory. Now, in World War II, after Italy invaded and occupied a portion of Yugoslavia, they employed denationalization for 4 years, from 1941 to 1945, at the death of Mussolini. So stemming from Italy's occupation, during the Second World War, Yugoslav charge number 1434, this was in 1945, given to the legal committee, committee number 3 of the United Nations at that time. Not to be confused with the United Nations, the organization, but the United Nations of Allied forces who were fighting in World War II. It stated, apart from killing, deporting, and interning innocent persons, the Italians started a policy on a vast scale of denationalization. As part of such policy, they started a system of re-education of Yugoslav children. They took over all the schools. This re-education consisted of forbidding children to use the Serbo-Croat language, to sing Yugoslav songs, and forcing them to salute in a fascist way. Keep that in mind. Where they did not succeed because they only had control of the children for 4 years, Hawaii, control will take place over a century, unfettered. 1906, that statement by Samuel Damon became a policy in the Board of Education. And this is where you have the program for patriotic exercises in the public schools. Now, each of you here have a copy of these documents, yeah, for your records, all the members of the committee. So everything that you see in this PowerPoint, you actually have the PDFs for your review after. The theme of the program was to indoctrinate the children of the Hawaiian Islands to be American and to speak English. Now, let's keep this in context. This is my tutu's generation, not my great-grandparents' generation, my tutu's generation. The United States could not convince my great-grandfather that he was American. They couldn't. But they're going to convince my tutu. In 1907, Harper's Weekly magazine published an article on this brainwashing. And they visited 3 schools, Ka'iolani Public School, grades 1 through 8, Ka'ahumanu Public School, and Honolulu High School, before the name was changed to President William McKinley High School in 1911. And here at the command of the principal, this picture shows the 714 school children saluting. And the caption says, what they say at the command of the principal, we give our heads and our hearts to God and our country, one language, one flag. This scene shows a salute to the American flag, which flies in the grounds of the Ka'iolani Public School, which has many Japanese pupils. The drill is constantly held as a means of inculcating patriotism in the hearts of the children. That term, inculcate, is brainwashing through repetition. That's the definition of inculcate. Now, when I first saw this, with my experience in the military, I'm saying we go to war against these kind of guys. I could not believe that was in Hawaii. But we hear stories from kupuna that say they get beaten for speaking English, or sorry, speaking Hawaiian. We hear those stories, but we couldn't connect it. Kind of thought it was more racial. I think what is more heinous, this was policy. Did you know even Japanese children who spoke Hawaiian were punished? Because Hawaiian was a national language of a country called the Hawaiian Kingdom, like Spanish is the national language of a country called Spain. Italian is the national language of a country called Italy. This was not native Hawaiian speaking in the corner. Hawaiian laws were both in Hawaiian and English. So the issue was not ethnic, but natives, being the majority of the children, were the ones who got hit the hardest. Then in 1976, we have this Americanization of Hawaii. So many things right in front of us, but they never tend to make sense. I mean, it's like we've been desensitized. So by the time this information has been institutionalized during my tutu's generation, more so during my father's generation when he attended St. Louis. And then, by the time I got to Kamehameha, out of sight, out of mind, I didn't know anything. Now that is an effective policy. Effective, very effective. And that you have to respect, but it's still illegal. And today we're the product of that. That's why we don't know, all of us.